everyone's familiar with the music from the Pokemon games for the Game Boy, but a soundtrack that gets completely slept on is the Pokemon trading card game video game soundtrack, also for the Game Boy. It was released just a couple of years after the original Pokemon games, and it's got a completely different sound from the mainline series music, conjuring up the catchy melodies, solid grooves, and all-around good vibes of 80s Japanese jazz fusion. What impresses me most about the soundtrack, though, is how it achieves such a full sound on such limited hardware. Much like the NES, the Game Boy sound chip could accommodate 3 pitch-producing channels and 1 noise channel to use for percussion sounds, meaning that music on the Game Boy mostly had to be arranged with 1 melody line, 1 bass line, and then 1 middle part that could either harmonize the melody, or do counterlines, or repeated rhythmic figures. The original Pokemon theme shows us a super clear example of these channels in action. We have our melody line, our counter line, and our bass line working together to bring us the theme that we all know and love. The limitation on the number of channels available provided an interesting problem for composers to solve. The original Pokemon soundtrack took a lot of inspiration from Baroque and classical music that was written for 3 individual voices, but most modern music requires way more than 3 notes at a time to sound right. Is there a way to get around the limitations of the hardware to present a more modern musical influence in Game Boy music? We'll quickly see the answer if we look at the Grass and Lightning Club themes from the Pokemon trading card game video game, which does indeed have a melody and a walking bass line, and this comping chord part featuring 2 note chords, and a high counterline decorating and interjecting the melody. What? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different voices. So, how did the composer of the soundtrack, Ichiro Shimakura, finesse a full band's worth of parts out of this little sound chip? The answer was to cleverly arrange the rhythm of each channel's output so that the rhythm of one voice fills in the spaces left in another, allowing one sound channel to accommodate multiple voices in the arrangement. You can see in this example how the wavetable channel, where we find our walking bass line, also covers the bottom note of each of these 2-note chords. These chords are always placed on offbeats so that they don't get in the way of the steady quarter-note rhythm of the bass line, a very practical choice that also sounds totally natural for the swung jazz style that the tune is approximating. The middle voice, one of the square waves, is mostly covering the top note of the chords, but it also jumps up to give these little counterline runs against the melody. It's mostly easy to keep the rhythms of these parts separate, as there's plenty of space between each chord here, but you do see a couple chords with just 1 note where this square wave channel was preoccupied with finishing a counterline figure. The top square wave channel is almost exclusively used for the melody, but we do see it drop down to cover a couple notes in the chord accompaniment at the end of the phrase, as the middle voice is still finishing out its counterline. Even knowing how these puzzle pieces fit together, listening to the whole track, it's kind of hard to believe there aren't more than 3 channels at work here. It's harder than it sounds to write 2 rhythmically interlocking parts that both sound completely natural too. If you can tell as a listener that one voice is filling in the space left by the other, then the effect is completely ruined. This oftentimes means simplifying each part, and the game's menu theme is a perfect example of this. The bass line stands with its own dedicated channel, creating the groove with funky syncopated rhythms and chromatic passing notes, outlining the classic Pokemon chord progression of G to F, a 1 to flat 7 move. The melody is harmonized throughout in thirds, taking up both square wave channels with its offbeat-based rhythm. And then there are these subtle fifths on beats 2 and 4 that emphasize the backbeat and drive the groove even harder. So again, that's 5 separate voices. Where do these backbeats come from? They come from the 2 square wave channels. The melody's emphasis on offbeats and general use of space leaves beats 2 and 4 wide open for the whole loop, allowing each square wave channel to fill in both the melody and the harmony on their own. The key is that these backbeat stabs are programmed to play way quieter than the melody and super staccato, creating the illusion that these are 2 different voices. It's a simple enough pattern to figure out and program into a Game Boy, but if this were a real musician's part, these instant volume and articulation changes would be extremely hard, if not impossible, to play well consistently. Another element used to create the illusion of more than 3 voices is called the duty cycle. If you look at the waveform of a square wave, like the kinds produced by the Game Boy's square wave channels, you'll see that it looks like a bunch of squares, hence the name. Both the Game Boy and NES sound chips could adjust the percentage of each wave cycle that was on to change the shape of the wave into skinnier or fatter rectangles. And this changes the timbre of the sound to become either softer or more harsh and nasally. By switching between different duty cycle settings as a channel jumped between notes, one can further create the illusion of 2 separate voices on one channel, each with a slightly different timbre. Listening to the normal battle music, you'll hear a strong bass line, a melody on top, and then these little stabs on beats 2 and 4. If I can break into some of my usual music theory nerd stuff, I love how the classic Pokemon 1 to flat 7 to 1 cadence is reimagined here by putting the flat 7 chord over a steady tonic bass pedal, making this a D to C over D to D rather than a regular C chord. It's a really great sound that gets at the adventurous spirit of the cadence in a more upbeat, colorful way that's evocative of the Japanese jazz fusion style. It's a much more straightforward setup than the first example we listened to as far as fitting these parts into 3 channels, but what you might not realize just by listening to the track is that the second square wave channel is doubling the bass line an octave up from the very beginning. The 2 channels blend together into one unified sound, so it's almost impossible to notice without separating the channels, and this blend is created by the square wave adjusting its duty cycle to fit the timbre of the wavetable channel while doubling the bass line and then changing the duty cycle ratio for a softer timbre when jumping up to these backbeat shots. This leads to some funny moments further into the piece where the channel plays the same note back to back, one doubling the bass part and one as part of the chord, and it still sounds like 2 separate voices thanks to the change in duty cycle. Yes, the number of channels in these old sound chips severely limited what you could do compared to having a live ensemble, but at the same time, each channel was capable of things that no human musician could ever hope to achieve, and not just lightning-fast runs or covering an enormous range, but also drastically shifting range and timbre on a note-to-note basis to create the illusion of multiple voices coming out of one instrument. Another tactic the game uses to create the illusion of multiple voices is to set up a repeated figure and let it repeat until it becomes ingrained in the listener's head. Once you've heard it enough times to stop paying attention to it, the figure can drop notes to make room for another voice without you really noticing. The pause menu music takes its time to set up a figure so repetitive that it'll fade to the back of your mind almost right away. We start with these high 16th note arpeggios outlining a G major 7 to A minor 7 vamp, and then after 4 bars introduce an upper harmony part on top of these arpeggios. After another 4 bars of this dramatic multi-octave arpeggio brings in this sick bass groove and syncopated chord part. To have enough voices to make these 2-note chord stabs among everything else going on, notes are taken out of the top arpeggio line to jump down and fill in the chords instead. The other note in each chord is provided by the channel handling the bass line, as you'll notice that the chords and the bass line are woven together such that they never overlap. For this kind of feel, rather than being a detriment to the music, these interlocking rhythms make everything groove way harder. And when this section hits, it really hits. The final example I want to go over is one of my favorites, and one that I could not believe was only 3 channels when I first heard it. Ronald's theme hits us with some super tight funk right off the top and doesn't let up for even a second. Ronald, please. It's too funky. This track combines most of the techniques we've seen throughout this video so far. The introduction sets up this repeated vamp figure, the 2 square wave channels decorated with lots of 16th and 32nd note flourishes, but mostly sticking to the small cracks left in the bass that's going completely bananas underneath. When the melody comes in, the 1 square wave channel gets dedicated to the melody, while the middle square wave channel continues a simplified version of that intro vamp figure, and then the wavetable channel jumps up in the spaces left in the syncopated bass line to fill in the bottom note of this chord part. In the spaces left in the melody, specifically the 2 bars at the end of each phrase, the top voice changes its duty cycle ratio and jumps down to join the vamp figure again, giving us these great 3-note chords over top of the bass line. The fully voiced B flat over C here sounds so rich and tasty. Setting up this super busy repeated figure in the beginning and letting it repeat so much allows the music to simplify the figure once the melody comes in over top, and it still carries on the vibe established at the beginning. The interlocking rhythms of the bass and chord part complement each other perfectly and sound completely natural. Both parts manage to make rhythmic sense without stepping on each other's toes. And farther into the track, Ronald gives us some of the sickest blues licks that the Game Boy has to offer. Ronald, it's tough. It's too hot, Ronald. I hope you enjoyed this little tour of the Pokemon trading card game video game soundtrack. I am super impressed with how these tunes were put together. YouTuber Bedrock Solid has some great stereo mixes of these tunes that sound amazing and are well worth checking out if you want to jam to some chiptune funk. Big thanks to Wodenaz for requesting this soundtrack on Patreon. If you want to join in supporting the channel, you can check out my Patreon via the link in the description. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.